My name is John Bluedorn, and I'm a Senior Economist at the International Monetary Fund in the Research Department, working on the structural reforms. So in the report today, we're going to look at the issue of youth employment in emerging market and developing economies. From that cross-country analysis, we draw some general lessons about the kinds of, what patterns we see, and then also what kinds of policies we see that are associated with improvements in youth job prospects. One of the things that I flag that we document is the very large youth gender gaps in employment and inactivity that we see in emerging market and developing economies. And that's one particular aspect. When I look at India, India has got very high youth gender gaps, one of the highest that we see at almost 50 percentage points, meaning that, say, the inactivity rate for women is over 50, around 50%, say, whereas for men it's quite low, like under 10%. So this means there's a really big gender gap between young men and young women in terms of their ability to find, or their being employed and not being in, or being in school. In terms of other kinds of India-specific aspects, is that we see that there are, one of the findings in the report is that it tends to be the case that if you have stronger legal protections for women in employment, so things like non-discrimination, guarantees of non-discrimination in employment, no legal restrictions on women's employment and the like, we see that tends to be associated with much lower gender gaps, and so that could be one dimension that India could make some progress on, as India's legal protections for women are not quite as strong as we've seen in some other countries, according to this metric we take from the World Bank. We also see that in the data that having more flexible labor markets and more open product markets both are associated with better youth job prospects, in particular for young women. And in that dimension, we see that in the case of India, India has relatively high minimum wage to average wage for formal jobs. That's something that could be looked at as it might be that it's too high, that it kind of discourages the formation of new formal sector jobs for youth. Another dimension there is other aspects there with respect to youth job prospects would be that you see countries that are more open to trade tend to have higher youth employment rates for both young men and young women. India is a more closed economy than some others, so being more open to kind of external trade, that could be another possible dimension. And then things like business startup costs, the administrative burden to starting up a business, all of these things are associated with, if those are very high, they tend to be associated with worse job prospects, and also greater levels of informality in work. And that informality is actually one of the key differentiators. The large share of informality in employment is one of the key differentiators between advanced economies and emerging market and developing economies. And India has a very high share of informal jobs in employment, over 80%. So that's a dimension, kind of trying to encourage the creation of new jobs and the creation of new formal jobs in particular. Those are some of those dimensions that I mentioned, are ones that policymakers could think about trying to calibrate better. So in India, I was looking at the data recently. I think it's over 50% of the working age population is under the age of 25. So this is quite a large number, and suggests that there's actually a big potential dividend from ensuring that youth have access to jobs. In terms of the inactivity rate, it's relatively high, at about 30%, according to some data we have that's built up from from the labor force survey. So taking those together, there's if you bring down that inactivity rate, which is related to the share of youth that are not in employment, education, or training, or the so-called need to be, bringing that down through the creation of new jobs for youth, at the same time combined with the large share of youth in the working age population, both would combine to create a potentially large employment and growth effect that would be very beneficial. So I'm not familiar with all the details of kind of the India-specific debate, but the issue of youth unemployment is a very common one across a lot of economies, and for that one, it's clear that emerging market and developing economies is a big issue, where for the average emerging market and developing economy, that youth unemployment rate is relatively high at around 18%. So bringing that down, again, through the creation of new jobs for youth, it can only be a good in terms of employment and output for any of all of these countries that are struggling with the issue of finding jobs for youth. Part of the aspects is going to be broad structural policies, but another part is going to be ensuring that the educational system and that training and the like for the next generation is sufficient to prepare them for the workforce, and to enable them to be kind of flexible and adaptable to the changing needs of the economy. As that what's going on with the future of work, of course, is something that no one knows for sure, and so ensuring that people have flexible and fungible skill sets is going to be a very positive thing. The World Bank has a 2018 World Development Report on learning, goes into this issue in a fair bit more detail. It's not something we look at specifically in this report, but I mentioned because it is an important dimension.